Thank you, Kermit. Thank you so much for being a part of Vintage in Review here, and it's all yours, sir.
Okay, well, thank you. So this particular airplane was built by Peter Jackson's guys down in New Zealand, the Vintage Aviator Limited. And Peter is like a god in this World War I industry. He doesn't fly, but he has a passion like I do for World War I airplanes, which is what got me into aviation. I think I know most people relate me to all my World War II collection and stuff, but this is what got me into aviation. First model airplane in RC magazine I ever bought had a Fokker triplane on the front. It was all red. I remember seeing that Blue Max film early on, and when I heard that song Snoopy and the Red Baron when I was 13 years old, man, that's where my path went. So this particular airplane, I did a trade with Peter. I sent him down an original Sopwith 1.5 strutter, of which I got out of Australia a number of years ago. There's only 3 in the world, and the British guys don't even have one. They have a kind of a replica reproduction in their museum. The other one's in Belgium, and there's mine, and that's it actually, just 2. So I traded that for Peter. There was kind of a dilemma with me. It was very original. Probably a lot of the wood could have been used, but what I traded him for was basically he built me this airplane and the Albatross, and I sent this engine down and the Mercedes that's in the Albatross, and they overhauled them for basically borrowing them to reproduce. I sent this Bentley. It's a BR2 Bentley, 230 horsepower. I sent this down, and I was down there for the Omaka Air Show a year later, and I couldn't believe it. And I'm looking at this like corn cob case with the studs hanging out, and stuff. And I said, "Oh, you guys are, working on my engine. How's yours going?" And the guy running the shop down there pulls over this freaking sheet. They had reproduced and built a new one from scratch in a year. I couldn't believe it. So Peter, like I said, is like a god. He's put so much money into these things. Billy Barker was the highest scoring Canadian pilot. He had 50 kills. He actually had 46 of them in a Sopwith Camel. This was his paint job. And I think the last 4 were in the Snipe. And he was the most decorated Canadian pilot ever. So that's really cool. And his original fuselage is in the museum up in Canada there in their National Museum. This is a double bay biplane as opposed to the Camel. This was really not intended to be a fighter airplane. They thought it was going to perform a little better than it did. It's a lot faster than the Camel and stuff, but because of the extra drag, the extra weight of the engine, it didn't perform as much as they wanted to. But I learned later that this thing was actually more designed for following some bombers for bomber escort, and it's actually got about probably a 3.5-hour range. We just use aviation gas in it, but with a rotary engine, they actually use castor oil to lubricate it, and it's a vegetable-based oil which does not mix with the fuel, and it's designed to do that way. This engine works, I think everybody knows the engine spins. So basically what happens is on a radial engine, like this airplane over here, it's fixed, the crankshaft spins around with the connecting, or the rods or whatever, and they go up and down. The pistons go up and down in that engine. The pistons do not go up and down in this engine. What happens is the crankshaft is bolted back, and it goes back, it's hollow, and it goes back inside behind the firewall. And if you can imagine, the connecting rod, or not the connecting rod, the crank throw on all rotaries are at the top. They're fixed, okay? And so if you could imagine with all the connecting rods coming out here and the pistons, if this engine was clear, when the engine goes around, that's a fixed center point. So the connecting rods and the pistons would look like a stagecoach wheel. They do not go up and down. They spin around an axis right about here. But because here's where this spins and that's where that spins, it's like an offset displacement pump. So they go up and down relative to each other, but they don't actually go up and down, which is kind of interesting. The castor oil, there's an oil pump on the engine, and it basically, whenever you fill the fuel tank, you have to fuel the castor oil tank because it's a consumable system. on the Albatross and the Fokker over there, the Mercedes has a, an oil system like you have in your car, so you fill it up, check it every once in a while. It cools it and it runs it through the deal. This thing is totally consumable, and the reason you got the cowl on there is that it pumps, the oil pump pumps to the crankshaft and lubricates that, and then basically once it comes out of that, the centrifugal force is your pump. And all the little things, they got little things here where it just drips out. And this thing's a mess when we land. My shoes have got castor oil on them, got castor oil down the belly, down the wing and stuff. And I got a kid at Fantasy Flight. Every time I fly, he's got to clean the airplane. And it drips everything. So it's interesting. And when we run the engine, maybe not in the wind conditions today, but anybody sitting back there, you'll be able to smell the castor oil smell, which smells like a model airplane engine because that's what they use. There's no oil system in a model airplane engine, so they mix castor oil in with the model airplane fuel. And obviously, if it's slinging all this castor oil out, it's a good idea to have a cowl, and it's a good idea to wear some goggles and have a lot of rags or a flying scarf to wipe your goggles. About probably every 15 minutes, I wipe my goggles so I can kind of see where I'm going. Maybe sometimes the windshield as well. This got two.
The exhaust, there's no exhaust. How's the exhaust work?
Well, there's no exhaust out, but if you can see on here, you can see there's an inlet valve and an exhaust valve. And when the exhaust valve opens, which is starting right about here, it just goes this way. So every other time the cylinder comes around, the exhaust valve opens right here, and it just throws stuff out. And you'll see it when we run it. Let's see, this particular engine has 2 spark plugs, 2 magnetos, and when I get it started, this engine probably, from my experience with rotaries, this engine probably has the best idling capability. I can actually get it back to about 600 RPM, but what happens is there's 2 levers in the cockpit on a kind of like a throttle quadrant, and one of them is like an air lever. It's a big, long, kind of a throttle stick, okay? And what happens is the crankshaft going back behind the firewall, at the back of it there's a little box, and on both sides you can see these openings here. The little round opening goes into that box there, and the lever controls a slide valve and allows me to put as much air into the engine as I want. And if you guys all fly, if you ever fly something with a constant speed propeller, it's got a manifold pressure gauge. Well, like right now, it's probably 30 inches of, mercury is what the pressure is right now, barometric pressure. And when you look at your gauge, before you start the engine, it'll say 30 inches. Well, as soon as you start that engine, it goes down to around 15 inches, which is telling you once the engine starts, inside the engine, there's less pressure than the outside air pressure. So what happens is when the engine starts, it literally starts sucking air into the back, which I control with the lever. Then there's another little lever. It's got a little round knob on it that basically controls a tapered needle valve that allows me to control how much fuel now gets sucked up in the back of the crankshaft. So this little box in the back determines with the 2 levers how much fuel, how much air goes in there. So if the pilot's controlling the air and the pilot's controlling the fuel, the pilot is the carburetor. Okay? And so basically, because there's not low-speed jets and things like that, if you try and manipulate back down there, to play with the right mixture control or whatever and get it down, I can get it down to around 600 RPM, which is almost a little bit too fast to taxi, and certainly too fast to come in and land. Wait till this guy goes by. If I try and get it below that, it just quits. It just quits. And on the little Sopwith pup over there, it's like 800 RPM. And the red line, or the top RPM on the engine over on the pup, is like 1,300 or something. And the same thing here. But at 800 RPM, that's way too fast to taxi. And that's way too fast to come in and land. There's no way you could do it. So what we do is when we come in and land or we taxi, we set it down kind of as low as we want, or maybe a little bit more. And then on the pup, there's one magneto, and there's a little button on the stick. You punch it, and it goes whap, whap. You're basically shutting off the spark to the spark plug. You're grounding the magneto. On this one, it has 2 spark plugs. So when I taxi out, I start the engine on both mags, and what will happen is when I want to use the blip switch, I have to shut one mag off because the blip switch only operates through the other mag. And one of the things that you want to be very careful as flying a rotary engine, if you were up very high, is every time you shut that blip switch off, if the lever's forward on the fuel, you're still pumping fuel into the engine, okay? And you're always pumping castor oil in there because it's got a pump that's always pumping the castor oil. So what happens is if you were up at a really high altitude and you just basically push the thing and shut the engine off with the deal, there's still oil going in there that's fouling the spark plugs. You still got fuel going in there. And so if you're lucky enough that the spark plugs fire because they're not fouled, now you got a fire hazard. Okay, so if you're at altitude and you want to come down in one of these rotary powered airplanes, you're cruising along and you go, I want to go down, and you just basically just shut the fuel off. The engine quits, it's still pumping the oil, castor oil through there, and then when you want to get down to where you want to get going again, you just slowly push it forward, comes back to life. Let's see, everybody knows, I think pretty much these airplanes have no brakes. They didn't have any brakes up until probably a year or so after Lindbergh. The first ever hard runway was built by Henry Ford over in Detroit. And the only way that the airplane can slow down is it actually has a tail skid which drags through the grass. And if you've ever been a fantasy of flight, that's why all my runways are grass, because we fly these early airplanes. And in World War II, a lot of the airfields in England were grass because they were trying to make them as fast as they could. So anyway, and one of the things that they've designed into this is I think the wheel location is generally a little bit further forward than it might be on a normal airplane because they want a lot of weight back on that tail, okay? And it's interesting, everybody knows with a gyroscopic load, like on a P-51, if the prop's going around like this, and everybody taking off. If you have a gyroscope and you move it this way, it reacts 90 degrees later. If you get a chance, take a front bicycle tire and spin it between your hands, turn it this way, and it'll react and twist 90 degrees later. So like on a P-51, when you take off, it's got that big metal prop. It's spinning this way. And when you go basically push the top of it and you lift the tail up, the airplane wants to spin to the left because it's spinning this way. You're pushing the top, basically tilting it this way. It reacts 90 degrees. So the Mustang goes this way, and that's why it takes so much, it's like 6 degrees of right rudder trim and a big foot on the right rudder pedal. This particular airplane, I learned very quickly. It spins this way. I learned very quickly. It turns great to the right, and it'll hardly turn to the left on the ground. And I basically, I just go whap, 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 whap. And what happens is, if the gyroscope is spinning this way, and it's like the Mustang, what happens is, if I want to turn to the right this way, what happens is when I turn to the right, it actually lifts the tail up slightly and lets it spin around in the grass. And when I try to turn to the left, it digs the tail back into the ground and it will hardly turn. Anyway, I only did that once, and I went off the runway, and I had to get my guys to go over there and grab the wing and spin it around. Okay, so how we're going to run this thing, I'm going to get in there, I'm going to turn the fuel on, I'm going to make sure the magnetos are off, and I'm trying to think, man, I got so many World War I airplanes in my head right now. But basically, these guys are going to, got a little squirt bottle. This is Paul, this is Ken. Give them a hand, thank you. They brought all these airplanes up here and
thank you, gentlemen.
Spent a lot of work.
Thank you.
And basically, I'm going to get in the cockpit, make sure everything, the fuel is on, but I've got all the air and the throttle or the fuel lever back on the quadrant, and they're going to basically squirt fuel into an exhaust, find an open exhaust valve, and squirt fuel on the spark plugs and inside the cylinder. So they're going to go every other cylinder, and then they're going to get them all loaded, and then hopefully it'll start right up. So we'll give it a shot. Okay, so I have turned the fuel valve on, and the mags say off, and both throttle quadrant levers are off, so you guys can go ahead and start priming. When I start it, I'll try and get it back to around as low as the idle as I can get it, which is about 600 RPM. Let me let it warm up just a little bit, and then I'll run it up to maybe at some point up to about 1,000 RPM, and I'll blip the switch a few times for you. But when I do that, I've got to shut the other magneto off. I just put about, almost 6.5 hours on this in anticipation of potentially flying it up here. But I went out, they had me scheduled really late in the evening because of winds. And I went out and looked at the runway conditions and stuff, and I just wasn't really comfortable. This is an extremely valuable airplane. It's got the only original Bentley rotary flying in the world. And we've actually had more interest in watching the engines run, so that's what we're doing now. Y'all ready? Okay, I'm gonna see if a little bit of fuel will come out the belly here. So I'm pushing the throttle thing forward. Got fuel? Okay, so I'm shutting it off. That's basically just making sure I've got fuel to the back of the airbox. And this airplane has got 2 fuel tanks. I'm sitting on the main tank, which is about 35 gallons. And then above the crankshaft, inside the cockpit, below the machine guns up here, there's about a 6-gallon tank. And of course, this would all be imperial gallons if you were over in England. And so it basically gravity feeds. And it's interesting, there's a way that you pump fuel up to the main tank before you start it. But when you start flying, this little venturi out here on the right strut, that's not for IFR flying. What that does is that basically creates a vacuum, and it sucks fuel up from the main tank to the gravity feed tank, and it works basically like your toilet does. You know, the little thing where it fills up in the tank and then it shuts itself off. That's basically what you got there. So, all ready? Switches are hot, and let her rock. Off says off. Ready? It's hot.
What about that, folks? Kermit, we're going to let you go. Thank you so much. Thank you. Hall of Famer Kermit Weeks. Thank you. Okay.